Hello, I'm Jocelyn, and I'm a physicist. And one of the things that I love most about physics is the fact that it gives rules to the things we see all around us and the universe itself. Now, in science fiction and fantasy, what we're often saying is we've got observations that don't match the observations that we know and that we actually have rules for in physics. And my favorite sci-fi and fantasy has people that are trying to find the rules that make all of this magic, or however we've observed new things, actually make sense. An instance that does this really well is Dungeons and Dragons. In order to do magic in Dungeons and Dragons, there are a whole bunch of rules, and the people who make those rules are wizards, the physicists of the magic world. So let's be wizards and physicists and take a look at how wizards classify spells in Dungeons & Dragons, and whether those actually make any sense. Welcome to fiction. The main way wizards classify spells in Dungeons & Dragons is by using schools of magic, where the different schools are supposed to be different types of magic. So they should really share some underlying thing in common that we can use to describe the basis of every spell in that school. But the more you look at some of the spells, the weirder it starts to get. So let's start off with what I would say is maybe the weirdest school of magic, Evocation. Evocation is the school of magic that deals with elemental effects, and that is the root of why it is so strange. Because what are elements in fantasy really? A lot of times in fantasy, they go back to a really old idea of elements, which is the idea of the 4 elements, or 5, depending on where you were in the world, where you usually have this earth, air, fire, water. The thing is, we know that's wrong. You can split water into hydrogen and oxygen. So water is not elemental. Neither are any of those other things. I mean, what even is earth? It's so many different things. But we still, in a lot of fantasy, tend to define elements as those things. But then you get the weird part of having things that are not the 4 elements that you now have to classify into something. So in Evocation, which is meant to be about elemental damage includes things like acid, or lightning, or thunder, which no one has ever called an element. But they're elemental damage because I guess we didn't really know where else to shove them. So that's why you end up with spells that kind of make sense in a historical context, like Flaming Sphere or Firebolt, where you're summoning, fire. Okay, that's historically accurate. But then you've got something like Acid Splash, where it's like, okay, I've got some liquid with some more free hydrogen, and that's elemental. Yes. The other weird thing about Evocation is it just, even more than throwing a bunch of damage types in there that have never been called elemental, for some reason healing is also in there. Like, Healing Word and Cure Wounds are elemental somehow. Evocation just gets strange. I honestly don't know why more fantasy doesn't just have, tellurium bending or iodine bending. Honestly, those could be very, very cool because a lot of elements are everywhere. They are found in so many things. If you're interested in learning more about that, I highly recommend The Elements by Theodore Gray, which I've linked his website below. This was one of my favorite books when I was younger because it is so cool to see how all of these elements you maybe never heard of are everywhere. So, I think it's about time that we threw out, fire bending and water bending and came up with something awesome like chlorine bending. But what do I know? Still, Evocation is just a weird school of magic because it's so hard to define what elements even mean. And then you get a lot of overlap with other schools. One of the biggest culprits of this is Conjuration. Now, the school of Conjuration is about making things appear out of thin air. If you're wondering why that doesn't include making something like fire or water appear out of thin air, you're not alone. In fact, Conjuration and Evocation are so close together that one of the spells I named as making sense as an Evocation spell is in fact a Conjuration spell. It's Flaming Sphere. For some reason, summoning a bigger ball of fire is Conjuration. In general, if you just think about the word, I would think of Conjuration as being almost any sort of magic in D&D. I mean, what is an illusion but making light appear out of thin air? What is Evocation but making elements appear out of thin air? But Conjuration spells are very specific things. In fact, one of the few things I would think would not count as Conjuration is a core aspect of Conjuration, and that's teleportation. Now, normally, if I made myself appear somewhere, I wouldn't call that conjuring myself, but teleportation is apparently Conjuration. An interesting thing is, Conjuration almost seems to have a key thing that ties it together, but that has nothing to do with the word conjuration. In fact, Conjuration magic seems to all be about doing things with other planes. So things like teleportation, or making a bunch of fey spirits appear in the form of animals with a lot of the conjure spells, like conjure animals or summon celestial. So there is something tying it together. The words just maybe don't make any sense. Similarly to Conjuration, Transmutation is maybe not the best word to describe the spells that are in that spell school. Transmutation is historically a word that was from alchemy that was about transforming, one element to another, like lead to gold. And it's still kind of supposed to be that in Dungeons & Dragons. It's supposed to be about modifying energy and matter. But again, that's really vague. A lot of the spells in Transmutation tend to be about doing stuff to you. So things like making you jump higher, making you fall slower, which isn't really turning one thing into another, but just kind of making things different. So, I mean, there is something kind of tying them together, but is it really transmutation as the word used to mean? Even weirder is the overlap between transmutation and conjuration and evocation, because all of these spell schools kind of do a lot of the same things. The literal elemental cantrips, the kind of 4 cantrips that let you control the elements, things like Gust, which lets you control air, Mold Earth, which lets you control earth, Control Flames, which lets you control flames, and Shape Water, which lets you, bend water. Those are, for some reason, transmutation, despite the fact that we have a school of magic specifically for elemental magic. Yeah, transmutation's a little strange. Well, evocation, conjuration, and transmutation are the biggest culprits for spell school weirdness. There is still weirdness to be had in the other spell schools. Illusion is about tricking people's minds, making them see things or hear things that aren't actually there. This includes, a lot of spells that kind of make sense where you're, minor illusion, where you make a sound or a picture appear before someone. But what is an illusion? Is it physically there? Are you making the light come out of that point to go to someone's eye? Or are you making it go into people's heads? Because if it's going into people's heads, then you are tricking their minds directly. You are affecting their minds. You are enchanting them, which is in itself a spell school already. Enchantment is a spell school that's about tricking people's minds, which sounds a whole lot like what you're doing in Illusion. Why is a spell like Hypnotic Pattern that is literally hypnotizing a bunch of creatures an illusion? How is that not enchanting them? How is Phantasmal Force a spell that is specifically creating an image in one creature's mind that only they can see, so we know it's not physical? That is an illusion, which completely breaks the idea that illusions are maybe just a physical thing and enchantment is something that's not physical, that's affecting something's mind. Even weirder, the spell Creation, that is making something physical appear out of nothing, is neither Conjuration nor Transmutation, but Illusion. So our illusions are now a physical thing. Who knows anymore? Let's take a break from the spell schools that all seem to be the same or just don't make any sense to talk about maybe the only spell school where all the spells seem fitting. Divination. Divination is the spell school that's all about just knowing things about the past, the present, the future, things you shouldn't be able to. And fittingly enough, the spell school that's all about knowing things really knows what its spells are, because every spell in Divination is about knowing things. Nice going, Divination. Abjuration, which is all about blocking, banishing, and protecting, is almost as good as Divination. I'd say there's only one or two spells that seem a bit out of place, like Aid, which is pretty much the only healing spell that goes into Abjuration. Aid is slightly different in that it increases your actual maximum number of hit points, but why is giving you more health suddenly Abjuration instead of Evocation when almost all the other ones are under Evocation? So there's a little bit of iffy stuff there, or something like Ceremony, which is doing a bunch of priest stuff. Apparently, marriage and religious service are protection. I mean, sure, but it's still a little wonky. The last spell school is the death spell school, Necromancy. This spell school is all about things that once were living being dead or just sucking the life from things that are living. And honestly, most of the spells hit pretty close to the mark. You've got like spectral hand that grabs on and chokes someone. You've got raising skeletons to fight in your army. They're all pretty safe. There's only maybe one spell that's really off, and that would be blindness/deafness. Because honestly, it seems kind of weird to put the spell that's letting you blind or deafen someone in with sucking the life force from them. Like, yeah, that's bad, but also that just seems kind of weird. Now that we've talked about each spell school individually, I'd like to really hammer home the weirdness of spell schools by talking about some spells that aren't the same school, but really seem like they should be. First up, Bark Skin and Stone Skin. Both of them turn your skin into something else to protect you, and yet, for some reason, one of them is Transmutation, and the other is Abjuration. Next, we have Firebolt and Produce Flame. They sound like they are fairly different, because one of them sounds like you're just shooting fire, and the other one sounds like you're making fire. But Produce Flames, you can also throw. In Firebolt, you hurl a mote of fire, and with Produce Flame, you hurl a flame. I don't know what the difference is between mote of fire and flame, but for some reason, that justifies them being different schools of magic. Hopefully this has been enough to convince you that spell schools don't really make any sense. But now I'd like to try and convince you that that's a really realistic aspect of Dungeons & Dragons. Because guess what? Physics schools, which you might call fields, don't make much sense either. For example, let's consider a light bulb. Now, light bulbs seem like they're pretty much all the same thing. I mean, it doesn't matter what type of light bulb you have, you put in electricity and you get out light. Kind of like with firebolt and produce flame, you're making the same thing. But different types of light bulbs produce light in ways that, in fact, belong to extremely different fields of physics. For example, fluorescent light bulbs work with something called fluorescence, which would fall under the sort of stuff I study, which is atomic, molecular, and optical physics. Versus the older incandescent light bulbs produce light through heat, so that would fit more into thermodynamics, which counts as a very different school or field of physics. And then even then, we've got LEDs, which are light-emitting diodes, and those use semiconductors, so they'd fall under maybe condensed matter physics, which is a completely different field. I don't even do much condensed matter physics, despite the fact that that has to do with things that are small, and it does have to do with molecules, but it doesn't really fit into the same field of physics because the molecules are a lot closer together, and so things work really differently. And that's where you kind of get into the nitty-gritty of it, that sometimes you have to classify things not by what you see on the outside, but about how they work on the inside. So maybe schools of magic in Dungeons and Dragons are meant to represent similar underlying principles rather than similar effects. For example, if we go back to Conjuration, it seems like Conjuration really has to do with coming from other planes. Going off of that, maybe the Conjuration spell Produce Flame is Conjuration because you're not making fire, maybe you're summoning fire from the plane of fire, which is a different plane of existence in Dungeons and Dragons. Then it could have the exact same root cause as something like teleportation, but its effect seems to be the same thing as an evocation spell like Firebolt. And this is something really fundamental to understand, which is the fact that our observations don't always match the rules. And even then, we can just be bad at naming things because history also has a huge influence on the way we classify things in physics. I mean, take atoms. With an atom, we still call the shape of probability that an electron can fill in an atom an orbital. But an orbital implies that something is orbiting. It implies that you've got this electron going in an orbit around a nucleus like a planet orbits the sun. We know that's not the case, but we still call them orbitals because we used to think that's how things worked. So maybe a bunch of these spells in Dungeons and Dragons, there's some historical reason why they got named that. Maybe Conjuration got named Conjuration because it used to be thought that you were just making things appear, and then people realized that it was in fact coming from other planes of existence. Because who knows how things developed in Dungeons and Dragons? There's a lot of very cool things you can start to incorporate when you start to continue with this analogy between magic and science, and talking about wizards in terms of being physicists and how would they actually make these rules? How would that build over time? How would their understanding of magic change through the years? Because physics is very, very cool, just like magic, but there is so much more than just the physics we know now. And that is one of the things that is beautiful to learn about physics in general, is that we are a product of the things that came before us. So, physics, in a lot of cases, might not even make sense, but the more you look at it, the more it somehow does. So, Dungeons and Dragons spell schools might seem fully ridiculous when you start to think about them, but if you keep thinking, maybe that's just the reality of where wizards live. Thank you for watching. And be realistic.